For Creamer Media's Polity, I am Shannon. Researcher and analyst Professor Raymond Suttner joins me to discuss economic rights in South Africa. Welcome.
Thank you.
Many people who criticize the failure to better people's lives over the last 20 years of democracy refer to the economic direction the country has taken. Should you not be placing more emphasis on this rather than on the Constitution to reach these goals?
Yeah, I think it's important that we don't make it an either-or question, because I am very well aware that NUMSA says we've had 20 years of neoliberalism and a number of other people say that with GEAR and some alleged secret deals with the IMF, South Africa entered on a growth path which set limits on what could be achieved. But I'll come back to the Constitution. I think it's important that this thing about a secret deal gets put in its place. First of all, I was in the ANC leadership at the time when it is alleged by John Polger, Arundhati Roy, and Ronnie Castles also talks about a Faustian pact. Now, personally, I know nothing about that, so that if there was such a decision, it was a decision, or let me say, if there was such an agreement, it wouldn't really have bound the organization. Some people may have said to IMF, look, we agree, we should follow a particular path. And so I don't know the status of that, and I really think this conspiracy theory does not help us to understand what happened. Nevertheless, it is true that in 1996, well, before GEAR, there was an approach in the early 1990s which was called growth through redistribution. And it was a Keynesian type of approach where it was argued that if people have more income, it has a multiplier effect. It stimulates people's demand, and there's a demand for manufacturing, and consequently the growth of the economy is also tied with ending inequality, redistribution of wealth. Now, that somehow got jettisoned, although there was the RDP. But the people who were pushing this growth through redistribution, it's known as MERG, Macroeconomic Research Group, I think it was called, somehow got sidelined. I wasn't involved in those talks myself, but when the ANC went into the elections, it went into the elections with the Reconstruction Development Program, which was a redistributive program. In 1996, GEAR was adopted, a conservative macroeconomic policy, and it said that GEAR replaced the RDP. Now, the way I understand it, I didn't agree with GEAR because it was not something that was decided in a democratic way by the leadership. It was presented by cabinet, by some cabinet ministers, on behalf of government and on behalf of the ANC leadership, even though we'd never seen it. And that, to me, was a problem. But I do recognize that the conditions under which South Africa acquired freedom were conditions which were not favorable to a developmental program of the sort that the ANC envisaged at the time. Consequently, it was necessary to take steps that would encourage investment, that at any rate would not scare away investment. When people say they never nationalize, I think that's not what I'm thinking of, because whether you nationalize or whether you privatize must be assessed on a case-by-case basis. Will it help the economy? Will it help developmental goals, because nationalization is not a silver bullet. Privatization is also not a silver bullet. But some steps had to be taken to stabilize the economy and avoid a situation where, when you have majority rule in South Africa, there's capital flight. Now, some people saw GEAR as doing this. It was fairly conservative macroeconomic policy, low inflation, low budget deficit, and cutting tariffs, a range of things. Now, people like Keynes and others who followed Keynesian and other methods have argued that for development it is not undesirable to have a reasonably high deficit for a while, because you can use that deficit to stimulate growth and development. Now, all the promises that GEAR was supposed to see realized, more jobs and more investment, never seemed to be realized. Also, phrases came into play like the fundamentals must be in place, but the fundamentals didn't include jobs and minimum wages and things like that. So there's a problem with that. But in spite of that, this word that people use, neoliberalism, I don't think is applicable to South Africa, or doesn't explain much, because neoliberalism usually means that the state withdraws. Now, in spite of these conservative macroeconomic policies, the state has been very involved in South Africa. Large percentages of the budget have been devoted to social welfare, healthcare, education, and social grants, which have made a very big difference in raising people from absolute poverty. Even though social inequality has increased, some people have been rescued from absolute poverty. So I think it is important that we recognize that in spite of taking measures which I believe were taken probably in good faith to stabilize things, they did not make it impossible to try to reach some of the constitutional socio-economic goals.
What do you mean by South Africa's economic journey unfolding within conditions that were generally more favourable to the realisation of social and economic rights than most other states on the continent? Why do you stress the tax base?
You see, when you look at some other states in the continent, let's just take Zaire, which became the DRC. Civil servants were not paid salaries, so that the only way they could sustain themselves was by taking bribes. And I think what it shows really is that there must be a tax base in order to fund the civil service. Now, if you look at the continent, there are probably not all that many states that have this capacity to fund the civil service as South Africa could, as Zimbabwe used to be able to do. I don't know if they still do completely. Probably they still can. And Botswana, I think, can do it. But a lot of states can't do it. And I think when South Africa facilitated a settlement in the DRC, they arranged for elections, but they didn't ask themselves, how do we make it sustainable by ensuring that there is an economic base to ground a civil service that can help reconstruct this country. So that is, I was saying South Africa, first of all, was much more developed economically, which enabled it to have a tax base like this, amongst other factors.
Finally, can the Constitution really be the means leading to the realization of social and economic rights?
See, the Constitution isn't the means in the sense that human beings have to do things through resources that are available. But what is distinct about our Constitution is the way it foregrounds social and economic rights. On the one hand, it says that everyone must have the right of access to certain rights. Now, that is found in certain other constitutions. In having this right of access, it also defends people from being removed from that access. For example, it's illegal to evict people unless there's an alternative. And that is part of the Constitution, but it's also part of findings of the courts. But beyond that, the Constitution also says unconditionally that the state has an obligation to provide certain socio-economic rights, particularly for children, healthcare, and nutrition and education, things like that. So the South African Constitution goes well beyond that of just about every other constitution in what it demands of the state. And that's why they talk about transformatory constitutionalism, that this is not a constitution which merely defends rights that exist, but also expects rights to be granted to people, and you can go to the courts if they have not been granted. Obviously, going to the courts is still a problem, that not everyone can get to the courts, but it is within your rights to approach a court, which it is not in Britain, for example, in many of these cases. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was Professor Raymond Suttner speaking to Creamer Media's Polity about the realization of social and economic rights through the Constitution.